Wow, Ethan, great moves. Keep it up. Proud of you.
Long time no see, my League of Levias. It's Mansant. We're back, hopefully, with some more regularly scheduled, polished content for you folks. So today, we're bringing you something long-awaited and not too overdue, mind you. We still haven't even reached ProQuest season for Dynasty yet, so let's get you all ready with the Berserk Levia deck. Blood Rush Bellow, Blood Rush Bellow. Now the first thing you'll need for this Levia build is to make sure you've got a couple tokens in your deck box real quick, and that is a Blasphemfet the Soul Harvester and a Quicken token, alright? Don't forget those. But the core of this deck in particular today is still centered around these aggressive Levia builds that we're chasing with Mandible Claws. Mandible Claws are, of course, a staple brute weapon that really combos well with Blood Rush Bellows to let you go 5 attack, go again, 5 attack, go again, into another large attack to close the combat chain off. Now, that is strong in and of itself, but there's actually a lot of other draw and discard synergies in this Levia deck that make it a bit of a race car. You're just throwing yourself against your opponent, and whenever you have extra resources to sink into your turn, Mandible Claws become a really great way to do that. Just turn 3 resources into likely 3 damage with go again. So that's a bit of the core of this game plan today. We're trying to go as fast as possible. We're looking to race. We're looking to not block if we can help it, all right? For anyone perhaps a little bit new to the world of Levia, a new member for the league that we have gathered here, there are 3 main reasons why you really want to be playing this hero. First and foremost, Carrion Husk. You've probably played against it, you might have seen it in Chain when he was dominating the meta, and it is still a very good card in Levia. 6 block on 1 piece of equipment is an entire denial of something like a CNC, all in just 1 equipment piece. And yes, it does have Blood Debt, but with Levia, you overall are going to get to turn off that keyword. So that's reason number 1. Reason number 2, Levia has these Blood Debt cards, some of which are really overstated when compared to the kind of standard rate of a Flesh and Blood card. Now, the main thing to look at is how far above kind of the base rate cards of Wounded Blow, Critical Strike, Brutal Assault, and Raging Onslaught are you getting? So, great example, Endless Maw is coming in for normally 1 blue resource card for 9 damage. That is 2 rate above Raging Onslaught, which is normally a 3 for 7. There are a couple cards in Levia that come in that about 2 rate above category. Cards like Dread Screamer, a 2 for 6 that has go again. Cards like Graveland Growl, a 1 for 7 compared to a 1 for 5 in Critical Strike. Not all of Levia's Blood Debt cards are in this above rate category, but the ones that are definitely worth playing and worth abusing to really get that power out of your Blood Debt. The third reason to play Levia, and really my favorite reason out of the whole bunch, is because of these recursion cards that Levia has access to. Now, some cards like Deep-Rooted Evil, Howl from Beyond, Ghostly Visit have the ability to be played from the Banished Zone. Now, it's not exactly infinite because they all have their little conditions, but you're able to play them out. They hit your graveyard, and then if you banish them, they recur into your Banished Zone to be played again. So it's this little bit of a loop you can get going that gets really strong value out of basically an additional hand that you have in your Banished Zone. Now, you might remember from my spoiler video this new card, Berserk, that came out in Dynasty. Now, at first, I was actually a little bit unimpressed with this card because a lot has to go right for this thing to be any good. Because basically what Berserk is going to do is make you pay 1 resource, right? You're going to basically cast this effect over your entire turn that acts a bit as a beast within. Berserk says whenever you've discarded a 6, you're going to instead banish it and then reveal the top card of your deck. If that card is a 6, you draw it. If not, nothing happens. You don't even bottom it after the fact. So for Berserk to really gain any value, you need it to trigger twice in 1 turn. Because if all it does is replace itself, then you spent 1 resource for pretty much nothing, right? You just traded the Berserk that you played for the new card you drew. And Levia actually has a bit more blue 6s than Rhinar, so you might have just ended up drawing a blue 6 at the end of your turn. What do you do with it? You just throw it in Arsenal? That's not good, right? So you actually want to craft your deck to try to trigger Berserk multiple times in a turn. And if that happens even once per game, this card is really insane. You're not really building this deck to try to trigger Berserk in these perfect sequences multiple times per game, because if you can play aggressive enough, then even that 1 turn when Berserk is huge, you've likely won. So what we've done is built the entire deck around abusing draw discard effects and this whole strategy of, I'm just not really going to block. I'm going to race you because I know that my spike turns of damage are just better than what your deck can pull off. Now the main card for enabling that is Blood Rush Bellows. Bloodrush Bellow is the standout all-star in pretty much every aggressive brute deck, especially in Levia, because Levia has these cheaper 6s she can throw out in Boneyard Marauder that really make it easy to swing Mandible Claw, and then a 6-power attack now coming in for 8 for an 18 damage turn at minimum, not even counting if there were more go-agains or whatever else is going on with your turn. So Bloodrush Bellows is a huge spike card for Levia, and of course Berserk is another card that can make it get even spikier. If you discard that 6 to Bloodrush Bellows, that's going to trigger Berserk. Maybe you draw 3, maybe the card you discarded was a Beast Within, now maybe you draw 4, maybe the card you drew off Bloodrush Bellows were draw discard, so then Berserk triggers again, and you kind of get the point. The deck just goes on and on and on. So this is definitely your power core. Then you've got a lot of the draw discard package that's going to push that even more over the edge. So you've got Bare Fangs, you've got Wild Ride, you've got Pulping, you've got Savage Feast, and you've got Tear Limb from Limb. Now, it's a bit all over the place here, but you've got 2 cards that do very similar things in Wild Ride and Pulping. These cards are 2 for 6s that likely gain Go Again when they discard a 6 from your hand, and are another way to trigger Berserk, of course. You've got Bare Fangs, which comes in 2 for 6. If it draws and discards a 6, it's going to come in for 8, which is, I mean, that's swing big value damage right there. 2 for 8 is really, really insane. And when you can end your long chain on a Berserk turn with Bare Fangs, that final draw discard can turn into a card that you likely then arsenal. So really, really strong in this entire playstyle as well. You've got Savage Feast, which is, of course, the best of the discard bunch because it directly replaces itself with more control about it. You get to discard a card in hand at random. If it's a 6, then you'll draw another card. So if you can Berserk on the Savage Feast, then that's like a mini Blood Rush in and of itself because now you'll be drawing 2 cards. The trick just becomes, how do you get Go Again on Savage Feast? Maybe it's Scabskins, maybe it's an Artivore, but either way, this is a really strong card for that strategy. And then finally, you've got Tear Limb from Limb, which is actually, as I've been playing more of it, really just another 2 for 6 in Levia. It's basically another copy of the Wild Rides and Pulpings in a way. You have to get a bit luckier with it because you are working with unknown damage on that turn cycle because maybe you just completely punt and then you spent 2 resources and didn't even throw 6, where at least with Wild Ride and Pulping, if you miss, you still committed 6 to the combat chain in some capacity. But Tear Limb from Limb has been actually a little bit impressive in that it's a way to just turn your attacks really tall. It's another way to turn on Mandible Claws without actually throwing an attack out yet to bait around your opponent. And then, of course, it's another way to work with Berserk. So just a little bit of flavor in that blue slot, but I really wouldn't think of this card over anything more than just another way to turn 2 resources into 6 damage, which is something that this deck is really built to abuse anyway. Now, along with the discard package, there are cards that really like to be discarded, and that is Mark of the Beast, Beast Within, and then another new card out of Dynasty, and that is Skullcrack. Now, these cards all are a little bit different in terms of what they're doing. Beast Within is definitely the best one. Beast Within is going to replace itself. It's going to turn off your blood debt. It is just an absolute powerhouse of a discard effect. Mark the Beast a little bit less impactful because all it's going to do is turn off blood debt, but also enabling some cards like Deep Rooted Evil and Graveling Growl, which come up big for this build as well. And then Skullcrack. If you discard it, you'll gain a resource, which is something that's really like hard to plan for. It's basically another decent 3-card hand next to Blood Rush, where if you have a Skullcrack, Blood Rush, and a blue, that's a pretty safe play because it basically acts as just drawing a red off of Blood Rush anyway. It's just an extra resource that you're likely throwing into your Claw attack anyway. So these are all the cards that you're really looking to discard. Of course, you can spike it even more so if they're part of that draw discard effect from the top of the deck. In terms of the likeliness of that kind of thing, in this Berserk deck, we've really pushed the 6 counts in this deck overall. We've got 41 6s normally in the main deck. You can work around that number with a bit of the sideboard here. So that means, 66% of the time you are going to actually draw a 6. So Berserk is going to look for those 6s a bit more in sequence, right? You're going to have to draw a 6, discard that 6, Berserk triggers, look at the next card. If it's a 6, add it to hand. But like I mentioned, you're not really trying to get every Berserk to do that. You're trying to get the one Berserk to just go nuts and draw those 2 cards and just put you over the top. So these are the cards that, of course, yeah, very, very synergistic when discarding. So another big reason to actually play this kind of Levia deck is because she gets access to 4 more blue 6s than any other brute. So of course you're getting your blue Wrecker Romps. This is the only generic brute 6 that we've got access to, but Levia is throwing into the mix a blue Deadwood Rumbler playset and a Soul Harvest. So that's 4 more blues added to the blue slot that just bump that little bit of consistency for your Berserk triggers and all that draw discard package. Now in this deck, Deadwood Rumbler even has that draw discard text that can trigger Berserk. It's not really what you're playing for, but it is an option. And then Soul Harvest, you never likely play out this card, but it actually will come up every once in a while to just, oh, my graveyard's pretty large. This is a weird 3 blue hand with an extra card in there. I'll block with that card and come in 3 cards, 12 damage. If you can actually pull that off, I mean, that's a great rate. 3 cards for 12 damage, pitch 2 blues into Soul Harvest. It's pretty good. So the Blood deck core of Levia is actually pretty light in this build, but like I mentioned in that brief intro to this hero, you're looking to really abuse the Blood deck cards that add something truly unique, either power level wise or cost curve wise, to your Levia deck. So in this deck in particular, the main cards that are pulling that off are going to be Boneyard Marauder. Boneyard Marauder is a 1 for 6, and this is incredible for your Blood Rush Bellow plays and your small hands with Pulping and Wild Ride. If you can lead with a blue pitch on those cards, they come in for 6, they gain go again, you have 1 floating, you come in with Boneyard Marauder at the end of that. That's now a 3 card, 12 damage, really, really strong. But Boneyard Marauder's huge play is with Blood Rush Bellow. If you can Arsenal Boneyard Marauder and then come in with Claw Boneyard, that's 18 damage off of just 2 blues, and now you've reset an arsenal with the extra card to draw off Blood Rush as well. So this is just an absolute all-star. While it's not hugely above rate, you know, Critical Strike baseline is 1 for 5, Boneyard's only 1 for 6. It's the fact that there's a 1 for 6 at all that is just huge because there's no additional discard cost attached to it. Then you've got Dread Screamer, which is a really, really big card for Levia, coming in 2 for 6. Normally when you're pitching a blue first, you're leaving that 1 extra resource floating. This is going to gain go again, and then with that 1 extra resource, you can launch into Graveling Growls is kind of the main play there, or you can go even wider with a Dread Screamer blue pitch, Wild Ride blue pitch, 2 floating, Claw at the end of it, however you want to play those lines. But Graveling Growl is just a massive card next to Dread Screamer in every case, coming in 1 for 7 and 1 for 6. Because of the just huge above rate nature of this card, I do run it in both colors here. Yellow pitch isn't awful for the deck. Things like Bare Fangs operate really well on a 2-card hand of even a yellow pitch, right? Pitch 2, swing for probably 8. But even playing this card out and pitching this card out, it works both ways. Now the other main synergy piece in Graveling Growl in a Berserk deck is Berserk is going to banish that 6 attack card. And when it banishes that 6 attack card, all of a sudden Graveling Growls are live for the turn. So whenever you're playing out those Berserks, if you're trying to go really wide, and a really good way to cap off something that's already pushed with Wild Ride, with likely, you know, a Pulping in there because you're trying to stack these draw discards, is just slam down these Graveling Growls to end the chain. It's just such massive damage, you know, likely 18, 19 damage on these turns. And it's just, yeah, it's got its innate synergies anyway next to Blood Rush. Or sorry, next to Dread Screamers, even Blood Rushes when you discard Mark of the Beast or discard Beast Within, right? So I love this card. And then finally, probably the best rate Levia ever gets these days is Endless Maw. If you can pitch a blue for it, this comes in for 9 damage, which is an amazing 2-card hand. But it is to note, this deck actually sides out Endless Maw quite a bit, because Endless Maw is a card that means you really want to craft down your hands. And this is a deck overall that wants to keep its large hands, so Endless Maw doesn't exactly fit into every game plan here. Some of the other big pushes in this deck come from Art of War and Swing Big, which are cards that actually work really well in tandem with each other, because Swing Big, yes, on a 2-card hand coming in for 8 damage is really good. If you can add the Swing Big to a turn that had other go again in there, then you can actually do something with that extra floating resource and just make your turn a bit of a math breaker. And so Art of War is that way to forcefully give go again that makes those kinds of turns work. Art of War also turns on your cards like Graveling Growl, and also gets rid of maybe some clunky hands where your 6s just really didn't do everything they needed to together, right? Like what's a Skullcrack doing in a hand that didn't have discard effects? Well, Art of War in Arsenal or something can just banish it, let you cycle through your deck. Most of the time you are going to pick go again, and the main reason you're adding this kind of effect to the deck is to just keep your threat density really high. You know, you have all these draw discard effects. You've got the draws coming from Bloodrush Bellows. You've got the extra dig in Berserk. You've got the extra draw in Art of War. You're trying to just chain huge hand into huge hand into huge hand. So at sometimes you might actually clump your power cards together, but for the most part, that's really not how the deck's built. The deck is built to spread your threat and dig into the next one and dig into the next one. And if you can line that up, this deck will sing like a bird. So there's some final unique pieces that Levia can abuse with this build, and that is namely Deep-Rooted Evil and Mutated Mass. Now these might seem a little funky at first, they're not the recursion cards I normally default to, but Mutated Mass just comes up as a blue 1 cost. So whenever you actually do get this into play, either playing it out from hand, likely for just about 4 damage, or banishing it with Art of War, or maybe discarding it at some point, right? As long as this gets into play, the 1 cost is really big for how your turn cycles will play out. When you're ending with like Pulping or Wild Ride with extra resources floating, why not just finish off with a Mutated Mass? It doesn't have to come in for 6. It's most likely not really coming in for 6. Sometimes it happens though, and sometimes that's really big, but for the most part, it's coming in for 1 for 4 with a higher ceiling. Now, when you really have large hands, your opponent just full committed to blocking out, because if anything else, they just die, right? Deep-Rooted Evil comes in as just a way to spend your cards and not actually cost yourself any threat from deck. You're pitching in to still throw 6 damage. Now, Deep-Rooted Evil needs you to actually banish a card to make this playable, but on your really big turns with Berserk, right? Berserk is actually banishing the 6 you discard and making Deep-Rooted Evil live to get played. Of course, it's a card itself that maybe if you discard it on your Berserk, then hey, now it's playable directly. You didn't waste any time getting this sucker into its recursion loop. So it doesn't really come up all the time, but you might as well throw it in. It's a yellow 6, which isn't the worst. And if these cards really come up as playable, that's a lot of value you're gaining out of a really strong aggro deck just to begin with. Now, lastly, in some of the flex blue spots, I am still just such a huge fan of Eye of Ophidia, especially with all the draw discard in this build. You don't have to run it. You can easily swap it out for an extra Reckless Swing or more of a safe actual 3-block blue like Endless Maw if you want. But I'm really enjoying the 1 copy of Eye just to enable those extra 6 stacks in your deck to pull off something huge like Berserk. If it happens even once, the game is likely locked up. It's huge, huge, huge for the deck. You've got your 1 copy of Reckless Swing, and I wouldn't really look for this to end most games, but just knowing that there's 1 in the deck lets you play for it in the right matchups that are just grinding a bit too long, just to have this inevitability of, yes, I will kill you if you swing into me at 2 life or less. And if you do spike a game with it against aggro, cool, you know, it was there, it's an out that you do have. And then finally, Doomsday. I do still really like Doomsday in this deck, core as one of the blues, and that's because you're not ramping up your blood debt very quickly. You'll likely get to 6 blood debt by turn 6 or maybe even later. But that's right about at that mid-game point where if you do slam down Doomsday and get yourself Plasmafet, that is just an extra husk that you probably really needed to shore up that mid-game position you were in. Because if the game's going that long, that's actually not that good for this deck. So when you do get access to Doomsday and just slam this sucker out, that buys you into another large hand that you get to keep to just throw on top of your opponents and try to seal the game once again with a large hand. Because that is one of the downfalls of this deck. You need a lot of cards in hand to actually close the game. Your small hands likely don't go above the 12 block that your opponent likely has in hand, so you do need to craft ways to build that final big push turn to end the game. Your only cheeky ways to win are Reckless Swing and then dominate from pulping. Beyond that, you're still an honest brute player. You don't even get Intimidate. Lastly are some of the sideboard slots, and quick note, you can actually see all of the sideboards in the Fabrary link that I've got posted in the description here. I've gone through every single deck in the game. You can just click and find exactly what I'm citing for each matchup. So we're not going to dig into that in this video, but just to show you what some of those cards were, I did mention Endless Maw was part of that package, and then I am likely siding around with these cards as well. That is a Blue Dread Screamer. Blue Dread Screamer is something I'm taking in because it's a more safe blue spot than something like Tear Limb from Limb. Tear Limb from Limb is a bit more of a variance card, right? It is also a non-block, so in matchups where you really can't afford so many non-blocks, it's still a very strong blue slot to just throw in Dread Screamer, play it, send in a Graveling Growl afterwards, and you know, if you need to block 3 with it, you can block 3 with it. No big deal. Some of the other flex spots in your sideboard here is 1 Sink Below and 2 red Unworldly Bellows, and I'm taking these in matchups where once again, I need to actually block down to outvalue my opponent. If my opponent has hit effects that are going to lose me the game, going to put on enough pressure that, sure, I may be able to keep my full hand, but I had to keep my full hand because it was non-blocks, and you hit me with something that said, I don't really get to use these cards the way I wanted. Yeah, you do want ways to scale your hands down in scenarios like that. So that's what the Endless Maws are really good for. Also, Unworldly Bellow is really strong next to Swing Big and Bare Fangs. It lets you come in 3 cards for 12 damage, which is really good. And then 1 copy of Sink Below. This card is a bit of a declunker, right? If there's those critical points, especially against aggro at times, where all reds are just going to completely lose the game for yourself, then a Sink Below can shore that up, and 1 cheeky Sink Below can also get around greedy Bravo Oldhim players that go for these dominate plays, and then you get them with a Sink Below. So it's a bit of the sideboard I'm working with. None of that is really locked in stone, but it's what I've got playing around in that February link in the description. And funny enough, the last thing we're going to mention is the equipment. Normally, a lot of people start out with that kind of thing, but I think in this build in particular, it's good to understand why the deck's built the way it is and what card choices are actually making their way into the list to reinforce why the equipment is going to be run in the certain scenarios that it is. And the first thing to talk about in that vein is Skullhorn versus Crown of Providence. Now, Skullhorn is a card that next to Berserk just reads, draw a card. Now, you do need the Berserk to actually trigger for you to reveal the 6, draw it, but there are some matchups where the Crown of Providence wasn't really doing anything other than a little bit of hand fixing. So if you can turn those games even shorter and get off those Berserk turns, like I mentioned, that draw you 2, or maybe with Skullhorn, even 3 in a singular turn, that's insane to put you in the forefront. So that's when you're going to take Skullhorn. When you do need to respect a little bit more of these hit effects or hit effects that interact with your arsenal in particular, then yes, you do have to take Crown of Providence and just slow down a little bit. Next for the chest, we've got Carrion Husk and Spellfray Cloak. Now, obviously, Carrion Husk is the go-to in every matchup other than one, and that is against Kano. And I've seen a lot of Kano, thanks a lot to We Make Best. And because of that, I've started to include the 1 Spellfray Cloak because you are running some other AB pieces that we'll get to. Obviously, there was Skullhorn, and there's also Null-Rune Gloves coming up. And when you get to run those behind Spellfray Cloak in your chest slot, that's a lot of ability to just say, stop, Aether Wildfire, you don't kill me. And if Kano's always afraid to go for lethal, that buys you more of these turns where you just get to throw your full hands into them, and likely just win. So other than Kano, yeah, take Carrion Husk in every matchup. The block 6 is just crazy like we talked about in the intro. And lastly, we're going to talk about all these things a little bit together, and that is the arm slots and leg slots for the equipment pieces here. Now, the main thing to note is you do need to respect those Arcane Barrier matchups. Right now, it's the Kano line where you're going to end up running this kind of thing. It's the Icelander where you're going to end up running this kind of thing. But to really just finish out that rest of the Skullhorn equipment loadout is with a Null-Rune Gloves and a Hooves of the Shadow Beast. And I prefer the Hooves actually over Beaten Trackers right now for one reason. If all you're doing is cracking Beaten Trackers for an extra action point, that's on the back of a turn that already had some discard synergies in it, right? You likely played out, your Wild Rides, like your Pulpings. These are cards that already gained you action points in theory off of discarding a 6. So because stacking your threat all at once is actually just feeding into what an Icelander is going to do to disrupt you anyway, I don't want to run Beaten Trackers. I want to spread my threat against that deck with Hooves of the Shadow Beast. So that's my one little critique on that point. Then of course Null-Rune Gloves, just an AB piece. And I'm running it instead of like an Arcane Lantern because actually there's so much draw discard in this deck that I do want double claws, because if you ever catch your Icelander opponent on no arsenal or a clunky arsenal, then yeah, slam him with 2 claws. That's free damage you just landed against a wizard. That feels pretty good. Next, we've got the Skull Crushers and the Gambler's Gloves. Now, this half of the combo is going to be when you need that extra tankiness. When I was talking about those smaller hands that you're going to need when you're looking to add like the Sink Below and the Endless Maws to your deck, you're doing that because you're threatened by all of the hit effects your opponent has cooking. So you add a little bit more block to your game plan. You add a little bit more of this scaling down of your hands to your game plan, and you'll actually come out ahead in these longer trades because you just can't really force the short games that you normally would against a deck that doesn't have a lot of disruption. So that's really the only reason I'm adding that kind of thing. But what I'm trying to do is run Gamblers and Scabskins together. And that's because there are 2 cards that just abuse a Scabskins roll in this deck. Most of the time you actually have a lot of Go Again baked into how this game plan works, but with Savage Feast and Art of War, if you roll Scabskins and hit, then you are free to say with Art of War +1. You no longer need to say Go Again. Just say +1 and you got 2 free damage likely out of your turn. And at worst, if you rolled a 1 into a 1, at least you had an Art of War to add instant speed, turn off Blood Debt if that's really an issue, but in this deck it normally doesn't get that high. And then Savage Feast. If you can roll hit on Scabs on Savage Feast, that's insane. You're going to start off your turn with this as a 1 for 6 that replaces itself, which discarded a 6, which turns on your Mandible Claws, maybe triggered Berserk. There's just a lot that this thing can pop off with when you actually have that extra action point from Scabskin Leathers. The last thing, of course, is when you do have your recursion pieces in play, then that just gives you another little bit to play for with your Scabs, but you're not really rolling every turn. The deck has a lot of Go Again. Even in the blue slot, right, with like Tear Limb from Limb, you've got these abilities to turn on your Mandible Claws and just go a bit wider than a normal Levia deck. So that was the entire deck tech, everybody. And like I said, the link to this is going to be in the February link in the description. You can get all the sideboard tips there. You can also see a bit of the win rate that I've been playing on Talishar. I think I'm at like 70% or so on wins. So the deck's pretty solid. You can't lie about this kind of thing though. It is a brute deck that is centered around a lot of just draw and discard off the top. And if you've played Brute ever before in your freaking life, you know the feeling of a 1 into a 1. You know the feeling of play Pulping, draw discard your Blood Rush, and your turn just ends. Those situations do come up. There's nothing you can do about it. It's the little bit of randomness that we actually bring into the world of Flesh and Blood when we play Brute. But at the end of the day, the deck's still a ton of fun. The deck actually crushes in this current metagame to a degree I really wasn't expecting. I think this kind of Levia playstyle is a bit too aggressive for what I really feel comfortable doing with Levia. You're playing for such short games that you can tell pretty early if things aren't just going your way. If you had those early clunks, if you had those non-block hands that didn't convert into anything, what do you do? But at the same time, if you can actually get huge damage off early and let you construct these larger and larger onslaughts until you've actually just crushed the life out of your opponent, and those situations feel really good. You present a lot of damage early, but you don't actually present enough overwhelming damage if your opponent plays smart. They're going to have to respect it, play on the back foot, hope for you to stumble a little bit, but that's when you just go berserk and kill them anyway.